The morning haze clung to the treetops at Cedar Creek Sanctuary, a quiet refuge deep in rural Georgia. Dew still shimmered on the grass as Mabel Hartgrove sipped her lukewarm coffee on the porch of the main lodge. She was used to the peaceful hum of the sanctuary at dawn. But today, something was off. A sharp, panicked cry echoed from the primate enclosure. It wasn't familiar. It wasn't natural, and it sent a chill straight down her spine. She rushed down the path, heart pounding, boots crunching on the gravel. When she reached the far end of the fence line, her breath caught. Curled up under a clump of brush were 3 baby gorillas. No tags, no crates, no warning. They looked terrified, their tiny hands clutching each other, eyes darting like they'd just escaped something horrible. Mabel froze. She hadn't seen a gorilla this young in years, let alone 3 of them. Alone. Behind her, heavy paws approached. Thorpe, the sanctuary's most unpredictable resident, stopped beside her. A retired military K-9, Thorpe had served with distinction under Marshal Thorne in Iraq. But since his transfer to Cedar Creek, he kept his distance from most animals and nearly all people. Mabel opened her mouth to call him off, but Thorpe didn't bark, didn't growl. He walked forward slowly, lowered himself beside the gorillas, and laid his body around them like a wall. One of the infants flinched, but Thorpe didn't move. Another leaned forward, sniffed his fur, then tucked itself into the curve of his belly. The third hesitated before placing a tiny hand on his paw. It was a silent surrender, a trust none of them expected. Mabel stood stunned. "Well, I'll be," she muttered, eyes watering. Over the next few days, the sanctuary staff, Boone Haverford, Ruby Whitlock, and young Tessa Langridge, watched in awe as Thorpe claimed the role no one had asked him to play. He wouldn't sleep unless the gorillas were beside him. He refused food until they had eaten. And when Cyrus Blackwell from the county animal department came to ask questions, Thorpe placed himself between the official and the babies, refusing to move. Annabeth Roden, who managed intake records, tried to trace the origins of the gorillas, but no transport reports matched. No missing animals, no alerts, just 3 babies and a dog acting like they were his blood. Mabel began to feel it too, that this wasn't just instinct, this was something deeper. And as she reviewed the logs one night, a name from the past appeared, one she hadn't heard in over 20 years, Jedediah Crowley. And suddenly, everything started to feel connected. The rain came in steady sheets the following morning, washing over the red clay paths of Cedar Creek and soaking the old wooden beams of the gorilla shelter. Inside, the 3 orphans huddled together beneath a pile of straw, while Thorpe sat upright, unmoving, like a statue forged by purpose. His eyes scanned the perimeter, every gust of wind, every creak in the floorboards. He wasn't sleeping much these days. He didn't seem to want to. Ruby Whitlock had seen a lot in her 20 years working with rescued wildlife, but she'd never seen anything like this. Thorpe wasn't just protecting the babies, he was nurturing them. When little Juba whimpered from a bad dream, Thorpe nudged him gently with his nose until he settled. When Momo hesitated to eat, Thorpe growled softly at the bowl until Momo reached for it. Boone Haverford called it strange. Ruby called it divine. Back in the office, Mabel Hartgrove sat at her desk, flipping through manila folders and wrinkled transport logs, the name Jedediah Crowley echoing in her mind like an unanswered question. She hadn't heard that name since 2003, back when she and Marshal Thorne had worked with Army intelligence during the early years of the Iraq War. Jedediah had been a handler, quiet, withdrawn, but brilliant, and there had been rumors about something that went wrong in Sudan, about animals that were never documented. Outside the office, Cyrus Blackwell returned for a second visit, this time with more questions than answers. 3 undocumented gorillas showing up in the middle of Georgia? He said, scratching the back of his neck. That's not just rare, that's impossible. Thorpe, sensing the tension, stood between Cyrus and the babies again, his body low, his gaze locked. Cyrus took a step back. "He's not going to bite me, is he?" "No," Mabel answered from behind him, her tone firm. "But he'll die before he lets you touch them." That night, As the storm settled into a soft drizzle, Tessa Langridge knelt beside the enclosure, sketchbook in hand. She had taken to drawing the trio each evening, trying to capture their expressions, especially the way they looked at Thorpe. There was something human in those eyes, something mournful, and when Thorpe looked back at them, it wasn't as a guardian. It was as something else entirely, something familiar. By the end of the week, the story of Thorpe and the 3 gorilla orphans had begun to spread beyond the county line. A local reporter from Savannah had stopped by, followed by a wildlife blogger from North Carolina. Photos of Thorpe curled around the babies, especially the one of Juba clinging to his neck like a child to a parent, had gone viral. But the media attention did little to change what was happening inside Cedar Creek. For those living it, it wasn't a story, it was something sacred. Annabeth Roden watched from a distance most days. She wasn't one for sentiment, but something about the way Thorpe behaved gnawed at her. She'd seen him react to new animals before, defensive, cautious, even territorial. But this was deliberate, careful, purposeful. "It's like he's been waiting for them," she murmured one morning to Faye Winscott as they cleaned the lower pens. Faye glanced over at the enclosure, where Lenny was trying to braid Thorpe's tail with thin strands of straw. "Maybe he has," she whispered, as if afraid that saying it too loudly would break whatever spell was keeping it all together. Inside the main lodge, Mabel sat across from Marshall Thorne for the first time in over a decade. He'd driven down from Virginia after she left him a single voicemail. "I think it has to do with Jedediah." That had been enough. Marshall, now gray around the temples and slower in his step, still carried the air of quiet authority. He looked through the one-way glass into the enclosure, where Thorpe lay sleeping, 2 gorilla infants nestled at his sides. "Something happened," Mabel said softly. "Back then, you knew Jedediah better than I did. Was there ever any kind of experiment? Anything that didn't make it into the reports?" Marshall didn't answer right away. He watched Thorpe with a strange look, part guilt, part awe. "There were things," he finally said. "Things I wasn't supposed to see." Jedediah talked about bonds, about trauma, about memory in animals not being so different from ours. But he crossed lines, Mabel, lines we all agreed never to cross. Outside, Ruby noticed that the gorillas had begun mimicking Thorpe's behaviors, guarding the gate when staff approached, barking softly in their own broken way when they sensed something unfamiliar. It was unsettling and beautiful all at once. The lines between species were blurring, not out of confusion but out of choice. And for everyone at Cedar Creek, the doubts they once had were slowly dissolving, replaced by a quiet, growing question they couldn't yet put into words. It was just after 8 a.m. when the black SUV pulled up the gravel driveway of Cedar Creek. The tires crunched with slow, deliberate weight, and even before the door opened, Mabel Hartgrove knew something was wrong. The sanctuary didn't get surprise visits, at least not from people in dark uniforms and mirrored sunglasses. When Cyrus Blackwell stepped out, flanked by 2 officials from the Department of Wildlife Enforcement, Mabel's stomach tightened like a fist. Thorpe was already on alert. He stood tall at the edge of the gorilla enclosure, his body tense, ears pinned back, every muscle ready to move. Lenny and Juba clung to his side. Momo climbed onto his back, wrapping tiny arms around his neck. It was the kind of posture you'd expect from a mother and her cubs, not a retired military dog and 3 primates who technically weren't even supposed to be there. Cyrus took off his hat, trying to appear casual. "Mabel," he said with a nod, "we need to talk inside." Behind him, one of the agents pulled out a clipboard. Another placed a hand on the taser strapped to her belt. Inside the office, the tension hung thick. "There's been pressure from federal agencies," Cyrus began, shifting in his chair. "These gorillas have no transport papers, no microchips, no origin records. That makes them undocumented wildlife, and that puts your sanctuary at serious legal risk." His words were measured, but his eyes betrayed discomfort. "There's talk of removal, immediate relocation to a government facility." Mabel's voice was steady, but cold. "You're not taking them," Cyrus sighed. "Look, I don't want this to get ugly. But if they're here illegally, my hands are tied. You can't protect them forever. In the observation room, Faye Winscott and Ruby Whitlock watched from behind the glass as Thorpe moved to block the enclosure gate. No one had trained him to do this. No one needed to. His instincts were precise, protective. Juba mimicked his stance, standing firm on all fours, chest out. The other two followed. They weren't hiding behind Thorpe anymore. They were standing with him. Back in the office, a soft knock interrupted the conversation. It was Annabeth Roden, holding a wrinkled envelope in her hand. "This came in the mail last night," she said, eyes locked on Mabel. "No return address." Mabel took it, and as she opened the flap, a single name was written in bold ink across the top of the letter, Jedediah Crowley, and beneath it, words that would change everything. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Mabel Hartgrove sat alone in the back office, the letter unfolded in her trembling hands. Outside, the sanctuary buzzed with uneasy quiet, staff moving slower, animals sensing the tension. Inside the enclosure, Thorpe paced in tight circles, his behavior suddenly agitated, as if he knew something had been uncovered, as if the past he buried had finally surfaced. The letter was handwritten, shaky but deliberate. It began without greeting, no formalities. Just, "If you're reading this, then something I tried to hide has found its way back to you." Jedediah Crowley had been presumed dead for years, but the tone of the letter suggested otherwise, or that he had known someone would eventually find what he left behind. The writing described experiments unauthorized by any official agency involving trauma imprinting in animals, specifically in orphan primates and combat canines. The intention? To test the limits of interspecies bonding under extreme stress. Mabel read on, her throat dry. Crowley mentioned a pilot case, a dog named Thorpe, and 3 infant gorillas rescued during a covert operation in Sudan. They had been placed together briefly for just weeks during an evacuation. But something happened, something Crowley hadn't anticipated. The bond between them didn't fade, it deepened, and when command ordered the gorillas euthanized to prevent exposure of the unauthorized mission, someone intervened. "I lied," the letter said. "I never followed the order. I smuggled the gorillas out. I placed them where I thought no one would find them, until they were ready." Annabeth Roden stood at the doorway, watching Mabel as she reread the final lines again and again. "He knew," Mabel whispered. "He knew they'd find each other again. Thorpe." He remembered. She looked up, eyes glassy. This wasn't just instinct. This was memory. Marshal Thorne joined them minutes later, having been called from the outer barn. He read the letter silently, jaw tightening. "We all suspected Crowley was doing things off record," he muttered. "But I never imagined this." His gaze shifted out the window, where Thorpe was curled again with the gorillas. "And you're telling me that dog knew them? From years ago?" Ruby Whitlock walked in just as thunder rumbled low in the distance. "You better see this," she said, voice uneven. She handed Mabel a printed image pulled from the old military archives Annabeth had dug up earlier. It was black and white, grainy, but unmistakable. It was Thorpe, smaller, younger, sitting beside 3 baby gorillas. And they were the same. By the next morning, Cedar Creek was no longer just a quiet sanctuary tucked away in rural Georgia. It had become the center of a storm. Local news stations had picked up the story overnight, and by sunrise, national outlets were calling. Reporters from Atlanta, New York, even London began requesting interviews. A viral clip posted by Tessa Langridge showing Thorpe and the gorillas playing beneath a willow tree had already reached over 2 million views. The world wasn't just watching. The world was obsessed. Mabel Hartgrove wasn't one for attention. She preferred her sanctuary quiet, her animals safe, and her past buried. But now, with camera crews camped outside the main gates and helicopters occasionally buzzing overhead, she realized this wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement. People were calling it a miracle, others a mystery. But what haunted Mabel most was that none of them knew the truth. Not really. Inside the sanctuary, things were changing. The gorillas had become more vocal, more expressive. Momo had started copying Thorpe's body language, his posture, his protective stance. Juba was now barking in short, low sounds, almost rhythmically. And Lenny was drawing in the dirt. Circles. Symbols. One of which looked eerily like the insignia Mabel remembered from Crowley's research files. Boone Haverford had noticed it too, but said nothing. Just crossed himself and walked away. Faye Winscott began organizing the media requests, filtering out the opportunists from the legitimate inquiries. But it was clear. The world didn't just want a feel-good story. They wanted answers. How could a military K-9 remember 3 gorillas after nearly a decade apart? How could they remember him? And more importantly, what did it say about everything we thought we knew about memory, trauma, and love? Marshal Thorne, ever the soldier, took it upon himself to handle security. If the government finds out these animals were part of an off-book operation, he warned, they won't stop at asking questions. They'll take them. Mabel nodded. Then we have to make sure the world sees the truth before that happens. It was a risky move, but she knew. Public attention could be their only shield. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thorpe stood in the field. The gorillas gathered around him like a strange but beautiful constellation. Tessa captured the moment on her camera, no staging, no prompting. Just the pure, silent connection between species that were never meant to be family, but somehow were. And as she posted the photo online, she wrote only 6 words beneath it. He never stopped looking for them. The pressure from the outside world had become impossible to ignore. With every news segment and viral video, more eyes turned to Cedar Creek. Not all of them friendly. Mabel Hartgrove knew that public fascination could only protect them for so long. Eventually, someone with more power than compassion would knock on their door. That's why, against every instinct she had, she called Annabeth Roden into her office and quietly said, "We need to run DNA tests on all 3. Annabeth didn't question her. She simply nodded and got to work. Over the next 2 days, she collected hair samples from Momo, Lenny, and Juba with the same tenderness a mother might use brushing a child's hair. None of them resisted. In fact, they seemed almost aware that something important was happening. Thorpe stayed close during each collection, watching silently, never interfering, just present. Always present. The samples were sent to a trusted lab contact of Faye Winscott's, someone she'd worked with during her years in primate rehabilitation. While they waited, the sanctuary held its breath. Ruby Whitlock stayed up late organizing the daily press calls, and Boone Haverford started sleeping on the porch with a rifle across his lap, just in case someone thinks about trespassing. Even Tessa Langridge, normally quiet and observant, had grown more withdrawn, sketching obsessively, her notebook filling with drawings of Thorpe's eyes. When the results finally came in, Mabel opened the report alone. Her hands trembled as she read the numbers. Then she read them again. And again. The gorillas weren't just any gorillas. They were hybrids, each carrying traces of genetic markers that matched samples from a classified military canine memory study. In short, something had been altered, and not just in the gorillas. Thorpe's own DNA, retrieved secretly by Marshal Thorne from a vet record years ago, had already been tested too. The conclusion was impossible to ignore. Thorpe had been part of a covert neurological project involving emotional imprinting between species. His memory wasn't just instinct. It had been engineered to retain emotional bonds beyond natural limits. The gorillas weren't random orphans. They were chosen, paired with him as part of an experiment no one was supposed to know existed. Mabel sat in silence for what felt like hours, the report resting in her lap. Outside the window, Thorpe was lying in the grass. Momo curled under his chin. Lenny was asleep beside his flank. Juba watched the trees, unmoving. And suddenly, it wasn't just a miracle anymore. It was a consequence. And someone, somewhere, wasn't going to let it stay buried. Rain returned to Cedar Creek just after dusk, falling in slow, steady drops that softened the landscape and hushed the sanctuary's usual sounds. Mabel Hartgrove sat alone in the attic of the main lodge, a place she hadn't entered in years. Dust floated in the slanting light of her lantern, and the smell of old cedar filled the air. She was searching, though she wasn't sure for what. Maybe answers, maybe a warning. What she found instead was a small, unmarked wooden box behind a stack of yellowed veterinary records. Inside was a folded letter, sealed with wax and a faded imprint that made her stomach drop. J.C. Jedediah Crowley. Her hands hesitated as she broke the seal. The paper inside was brittle, stained by time, but the ink had held strong. It began plainly. To whomever finds this, I ask only one thing: try to forgive me. The tone was unlike the first letter. This one wasn't clinical. It was haunted. Crowley wrote of failure, not scientific but human. He spoke of bonds he hadn't anticipated, of pain he couldn't reverse. And then he confessed, Thorpe was never just an experiment. He was my last attempt at redemption. The letter explained that Thorpe had imprinted on Crowley himself before anyone else. But when the guerrillas arrived, injured, orphaned, and traumatized, Thorpe had chosen them, protected them, slept beside them, and when orders came to separate them permanently, Crowley couldn't do it. He looked at me like I was the one being tested, and I failed. Outside, Thorpe let out a low growl, not one of aggression, but alertness. Tessa Langridge, who had taken to keeping watch near the enclosure with a flashlight and notebook, looked up quickly. She spotted movement near the tree-lean figures. 2, maybe 3. No lights, no sound, just shadows creeping in the rain. She ran toward the lodge, heart pounding. Mabel was still holding the letter when the front door burst open. Tessa stood in the entryway, soaked, panting. "There's someone in the woods," she said breathlessly. "They're not media. They're watching." Marshal Thorne reached for the old pistol he kept locked in the back office. Boone Haverford had already lit a lantern and was stepping out onto the porch, rifle in hand. Ruby Whitlock locked down the main gates. And Mabel? She tucked the letter into her coat, not to hide it, but to keep it safe for what was coming. Because the world might have fallen in love with Thorpe and the guerrillas, but someone out there wanted that story buried for good. The storm raged through the night, lashing against the windows of Cedar Creek with a fury that felt almost personal. Inside the main lodge, the staff remained on high alert. The shadows Tessa Langridge had seen near the tree-lean hadn't returned, but the feeling hadn't left. Something or someone was closing in. Mabel Hartgrove paced the hallway with the letter still pressed to her chest, as if Crowley's confession could shield them all. Thorpe hadn't moved from his position in front of the enclosure. Rain soaked his coat, but he stayed there, silent, alert. The guerrillas were huddled just behind him, unusually still. Even Lenny, the most playful of the three, hadn't made a sound. They knew, somehow, that this was no longer just a matter of memory or science. It was survival. At first light, Marshal Thorne and Boone Haverford did a full perimeter sweep. Near the creek bed, they found fresh boot prints, military issue. Boone knelt down, touched the soil. "They were close," he muttered. "Too close." Marshal said nothing, but his jaw clenched. He knew that kind of silence. It was the kind that preceded government cleanup teams. No questions, no explanations, just erasure. Back inside, Annabeth Roden pulled out a storage box from the archive room labeled 2009. In it were scanned medical logs, behavioral charts, and old communications between the sanctuary and a former government partner. Most were redacted, but one file, missed by whoever tried to bury it, had Crowley's signature and a note. Subject: Thorpe demonstrates emotional memory recall far beyond projected limits. Separation from the guerrillas induces physical distress. Faye Winscott read it out loud, then looked to Mabel. He didn't just love them, Mabel. He needed them. They're not just a bond. They're his stability, his reason. The room fell silent. For all the science and secrecy, the truth had always been simple. Thorpe hadn't just protected the guerrillas. He had been protecting himself from the pain of losing them again. And now, with outside forces drawing near, the sanctuary faced an impossible choice. Turn over the guerrillas to save themselves legally, or fight to keep them together and risk losing everything. Mabel looked around at the faces she trusted, worn by sleepless nights and hard truths. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. In the yard, Thorpe stood facing the woods. A low rumble echoed from his chest, primal and ancient. He knew. They all did. This was the last time anyone would try to take his family. The morning sun broke through the clouds as if it, too, had been waiting for the storm to pass. The air was still damp, but something had shifted at Cedar Creek. After weeks of tension, fear, and hidden truths, the people who had once come to care for animals were now preparing to defend them with everything they had. Mabel Hartgrove stood on the porch, the final letter from Jedediah Crowley in her hand. It was time to speak. She called a press conference, but not for show. This one was different. Local reporters gathered near the fence line, joined by cameras from national networks and independent journalists. The sanctuary staff, Marshall Thorne, Faye Winscott, Annabeth Roden, Boone Haverford, Ruby Whitlock, and young Tessa Langridge, stood behind her, silent but united. Thorpe sat at the center, the three gorillas pressed close to him. The world needed to see not just the story, but the truth. Mabel read the letter aloud. Every word. Crowley's confession, the experiment, the betrayal, and the bond that had outlived orders, memory, and even war. She spoke of love, raw, instinctive, and powerful. They weren't just subjects, she said, voice steady. They were survivors, and they found each other again, not because of science, but because of heart. When she finished, no one clapped. No one moved. It was too sacred for applause. By that afternoon, the tide had turned. Public pressure exploded online. Hashtags like #LetThemStay and #Thorpe and his boys flooded social media. Legal teams offered pro bono support. Celebrities posted videos urging the government to back off. Even a retired senator released a statement condemning the original experiments as morally bankrupt. What had begun as a mystery was now a cause. 2 days later, the official order to remove the gorillas was quietly withdrawn. No formal explanation, just silence, like the government hoped the world would forget. But Cedar Creek didn't forget. Neither did the millions who had watched Thorpe defy everything we thought we knew about loyalty. And certainly not the gorillas, who now followed Thorpe wherever he went. Not as pets, not as projects, but as sons. That evening, as golden light washed over the sanctuary, Tessa painted a small wooden sign by the entrance. With careful brush strokes, she wrote, "Welcome home, Thorpe and family." Boone hammered it into the ground, right beside the old gate. Ruby wiped a tear. Annabeth said nothing, but placed her hand on Mabel's shoulder. And in the middle of the open field, surrounded by the only creatures who had ever made him whole, Thorpe finally laid down. Not as a soldier, not as a subject, but as a father where he belonged.